You see, I think in the end, what marks me is in reading all these novels, I'm making friends. And friends change you. And friendship cannot be achieved easily or quickly.
Welcome to Not Just Theologians, Dominicans and their peculiar pursuits. In their 800-year history, Dominicans have shown a notable fascination for the curious and the bizarre. St. Catherine de' Ricci liked to bake marzipan, St. Margaret of Hungary bred hedgehogs, and St. Albert the Great was enchanted by worms in the garden. The mind of a preacher requires a willingness to seek truth in all things, to see the hand of God at work in the whole of his creation. And so Dominican life has always encouraged a healthy eclecticism, a zeal for the peculiar, a living out of St. Paul's maxim to take every thought captive for Christ. Not Just Theologians is a new series in which we will explore some of the peculiar pursuits and passions of the friars, to see where a mind in pursuit of truth might be led. This week, we speak with the former master of the Dominican Order and now itinerant preacher, Fr Timothy Radcliffe, all about novels.
So I'm here this week with Fr Timothy Radcliffe, former Master of the Order and our resident itinerant preacher, if you can be a resident itinerant preacher. So Fr Timothy, how did you first start reading novels?
When I was 8 years old, I had a school teacher, English teacher, called Peter Wigham, who later became known as a minor poet, translator of Catullus' poems. And if we were very, very good, he used to read aloud from Dickens. And I learnt two things from that, really. That, in fact, literature was enjoyable. And secondly, of course, the wonderful thing about Dickens is Dickens takes pleasure in his characters. And so you learn to take pleasure in them as well. And I went home for Christmas. My mother asked what I wanted for a Christmas present. And I said, I'd like a novel by Dickens, aged 8. And my mother thought this was a bit absurd. She asked my grandmother, and she said, let him have a book, and he might not understand much about it, but he will love the music. And what about you, Albert?
So I think I was probably about the same age, but I remember it being one of the things that I always spent my pocket money on, and whenever I got money I would buy a book. I kind of obsessively as a teenager. When I was a novice, we got a very small asinesta, a very small sort of pocket money every month, basically. And at the first day of every month, I would go down to the bookshop and buy 4 novels for the month, for each of the months of my novitiate. So, as Master of the Order, you have obviously travelled quite a lot.
Yes, I was travelling 8 months a year, 6 weeks on the road, 2 weeks at home. And reading novels was really important to me for 2 reasons. First of all, if you're in a different bed every single night, you need some continuity. And so what really kept my life together, gave it a sense of continuity, was I would take very long novels. Patrick O'Brian, who I absolutely love, extraordinary stories of the improbable friendship of two people at the beginning of the 19th century. I could go to bed at night and there would be 2 friends that I knew waiting to carry me through. The other really important thing about novels for me then was that it opened my mind and my heart to other ways of being a human being. Often when I travelled to a new place, I'd ask the provincial, what novels should I read about your culture? And for example, in Latin America, my Spanish was bad, but I slowly began to learn it. And so reading books like Gabriel García Márquez, Cien Años de Soledad, Mario Vargas Llosa, La Tía María, y Julia, El Escribidor, these opened me to other ways of living and being human. And I always love what Aquinas said. The soul is, in a sense, all things. And what I think novels do is they expand your soul. And in that sense, I think reading novels is deeply linked to learning how to love. Because one's brought out of one's little narrow English world, and you learn to love people who are very different. Similarly, when I went to France as a student for a year, I just read and read and read French literature, not just so that I could speak French better, but so that I could become, in a certain sense, French. So for me, novel reading has always been about magnanimity, big-souledness, expansion of one's being.
I think you get a really different appreciation for different places, different people, and it gives a real depth to going. So I'm interested that you always asked the provincial of a country to recommend literature, because I think it gives you, I think when you go to a place you can see all these different things, you can speak to all these different people, but there's a real kind of depth that you get to an encounter when you try and encounter something of the best things of their culture, which, you know, were written 200, 300 years ago. So you get some kind of sense of the depth. And those kinds of ideas, just as Dickens and Jane Austen are kind of floating around in our culture, even more so Shakespeare, you get this real sense of the three-dimensional quality of a culture. I travelled quite a lot when I was at university, because I studied anthropology. And curiously, sometimes I read novels from home while I was away to remind me of home. But I did also read a lot of literature from these different places, just to get some sense of sort of more three-dimensional sense of the culture.
Absolutely, and I remember Cornelius Ernst, who was one of my first teachers in the order. Fascinating man. And he said, it must be possible to find God in the complexity of human experience. And I think what novels do is they introduce you to the complexity. And I think particularly if we're theologians, we cannot let ourselves work with simplistic ideas of what it is to be a human being. You've got to enter into the difficulties, the challenges, why it is that good and lovely people end up by doing bad things. One of the things I love about Dickens is he helps us to love the bad people, like Mrs. Gamp in Martin Chuzzlewit. It brings you beyond all simplistic moralism towards something which is much better, which is morality.
Yeah, I think there's a character, I really enjoy Flannery O'Connor's short stories, and there are these curious characters who, they're not really straightforwardly wicked people, actually. A lot of them are just simply self-interested and self-obsessed. And the best thing about her novels, really, is the way in which she is able to show a complete transformation of a person in an instant moment, which might be in the most harrowing of ways, you know, the death of an entire family, or being gored to death by a bull. I mean, they're not kind of, you know...
Usually happy afternoon events. Yes.
But in those moments, you do get this real transformation of the character. And it, I think, helps you to see that kind of, you know, difficult character that they were before is still, in a curious way, really lovable. And they're lovable because they're redeemable in that moment. And I think there's something very important in really engaging with the characters in books. Sometimes I find it very difficult because there are characters which I just cannot cope with. I remember reading a William Boyd novel. I can't quite remember which one it was, but there was one character in it that I could not stand at all. And I had such a kind of difficulty with this character that I had to just completely stop reading the novel, just put it to one side. But I do think that kind of engagement with the character is important, because I think it's that really does open us up to some kind of experience in the novel which transforms us as well.
I think one of the most challenging novels that I've ever read was Yanagihara's A Little Life, which is a wonderfully, beautifully written story about a chap called Jude and his 4 friends in New York. It won the Man Book Prize, I think, in 2015. But what you slowly see is how tortured Jude has been in his youth by an experience of sexual abuse. And actually living through the unveiling of what this has done to him is profoundly painful. But I'm glad I had to do it. And I had to do it in the end because I came to like him. And it's when you like somebody that you can take on board all the experience that they lived through, the pain and the joy. And as you said, yourself be transformed.
Throughout all of our lives we encounter difficult situations, and I think the only thing that really prepares you for it is prayer. But I think you can get something from books, from novels, and it's not to turn novels or books into some kind of tool, but I do think that novels open us up to other people's experiences, to other people's lives in a way that's valuable.
I think also it is, we believe, it's an article of our faith, that anyone who exists is lovable, because they're sustained in existence by God who loves them. And therefore, in all pastoral care, you are trying to glimpse how somebody is lovable, because that's how God sees them. And I think that good novels educate you, they educate your eye and your sensitivity, so that you can get a tiny glimpse of how even the most unattractive people are actually sustained by God's love. Otherwise they wouldn't exist.
We've started to talk a little bit about the more theological questions, but have you found that reading novels has informed your theology? How's it?
It's, I think, absolutely essential to my theology, because if in my theology, in any theology, we are trying to make sense of what we live in terms of the gospel, anyone who has insight into what it means to be alive is our ally. Anybody who is honest about the struggle to live, to love, to face suffering, all these people, if what they say is true to lived experience, then I can sit at their feet. Aquinas said, whenever anybody says what is true, it is always of the Holy Spirit. And you see that, of course, in Aquinas, his openness to pagan writers, to Muslim writers, to Jewish writers. Theology always lives from the pursuit of truth, illuminated by the gospel, but also the truth of what we discover, illuminating the gospel. So one's always in that dialogue of experience in the gospel. And for me, novel writing, poetry as well, but that's another subject, have always been illuminating in that sense. If God is love, whoever speaks wisely about love.
So what are the important books, your favourite books, the kinds of things that you always suggest that people should read?
Well, I'll tell you, if I had to choose one great novel that I'd go back to, it would be Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. I think people tend to be either they love Dostoevsky or they love Tolstoy. I've tried with Dostoevsky time and again, but I've never really succeeded, whereas I love Tolstoy. And I think Anna Karenina is such an absolutely wonderful story. First of all, because it tells you about somebody who through love gets into a terrible mess, as we all can. There she is, married to this awful, dry bureaucrat. He makes me think in his aridity of somebody like Casaubon in Middlemarch. And her heart is captured by Count Vronsky. And you want to say, yes, Anna, I understand why you got into this mess. And you see her terrible, crucifying jealousy that she then gets into, having run away with Vronsky. And you say, yes, how right, that's how it is. And the terrible slow movement towards tragedy, always involving trains. There are always trains in Anna Karenina. And then there's the other story of Levin, Konstantin Levin, the landowner, who's seeking God. And you have, I think, one of the most glorious scenes in the whole of literature, that day that he goes scything with his peasants, his serfs. It's an extraordinary rural idyll. You feel that the sky opens and eternity breaks through, because he believes that salvation comes through contact with the land. And there he is searching to believe, and he meets this peasant, Platon, I think he's called. And he says of him, he lived for his soul and for love of God. And so this educated, sophisticated, complex man is brought to some faith in the end by one of his own peasants. So if there was a novel I would recommend people to read and to go back to time and again, it would be Anna Karenina.
I think I love. I've read quite a few big Russian books, and I remember the first time I tried to read one, and I failed completely, and it took me about 6 attempts to get through the Brothers Karamazov, and I just recently tried Demons again, and I did manage it once, and I tried to reread it, and again I haven't been able to quite get through it. But those stories, these huge Russian novels, I really love them because, one, they take forever to read, and I think there is something about investing time.
Absolutely.
If you're going to try and do it, you really do have to invest time. Part of me thinks that, they were that long because Russian winters are cold and long, and so you've got to fill the time somehow. But I like Dostoevsky, but I also like Tolstoy. I quite like the short stories that Tolstoy wrote.
I was nurtured on his short stories by my nanny.
Okay.
One of the earliest books I had was a collection of his short stories.
The thing I really do love about these huge novels by Dostoevsky and by Tolstoy is the fact that they're just a massive sweep of people's lives, their loves and their griefs, and unexpectedly coming into fortunes and then losing all their money, or finding long lost relatives. And I guess, in a strange kind of way, it's like reading one of Aquinas' biblical commentaries, because you have to go through this whole sweep in order to get to the nugget of information that you're looking for.
But that's like friendship. You see, I think in the end, what marks me is in reading all these novels, I'm making friends. And friends change you. And friendship cannot be achieved easily or quickly. I think what's so important in my lives are old friendships. And to attain a friendship in a novel means I think it's usually best if it's very long.
Yeah.
I love War and Peace, which I've read 3 times. You have to leave out the bit about the philosophy of history, which is always very boring. But there you do get, I did enjoy enormously Sally Rooney's Normal People. Much shorter, but you feel in contact with young people of another generation of my own, and you acquire sympathy and affection for them.
In lots of novels we find people who really have gone very far off the road. And, encountering them in a novel does actually give you, we've spoken a bit about this, but it does give you some sense of how people get there. And it gives you some sense of where they're coming from. So when people talk to you about very complicated questions in their lives, you do get this sense of actually their point of view in a whole new way, which hopefully makes you more sensitive to their kind of questions and their demands and things.
But I think that's what I love about the Father Brown stories of Chesterton. And he says at one stage, if you ever think that you might not have done it, you're a Pharisee. And I think that entry into another person, you discover either that you've done it or you've probably dreamt of doing it. I think there's another factor, is that our medieval ancestors grew up with an overarching narrative. Every time you went into a great cathedral, you entered a narrative, and it was there in the stone, it was there in the stained glass windows, and it led ultimately to the possibility of salvation and mercy. And when, after the Reformation, this drama ceased to have its hold on our imagination, people struggled to make sense of their experience, particularly when they got into a mess. And I think that that's why novel writing became so absolutely important. I'm not a student of the area, but I should imagine, particularly in the time of the first George, because when you needed narratives that gave hope. And that's why, if you read Pride and Prejudice, for example, or Middlemarch, or Dickens, you always tend to a happy ending. And people can be very sophisticated and say that this is fantasy. But I actually think it's one of the ways that people could find hope in whatever the mess is and the entanglements and the confusion on the way. Somehow, by providence, we would say, by divine providence, people were brought through to some resolution and some contentment.
Yeah. Have you ever found that you can, you don't want to turn these kinds of stories into just convenient ploys for evangelization, but I mean, do you find it useful to take that kind of understanding of hope, that kind of arc of a narrative of hope, and turn it towards preaching, for example?
Yes, I think it inhabits really all our preaching, because it sustains us as hopeful people too. I think there are some wonderful novels. I love The Power and the Glory by Graham Greene, which of course is dedicated to an old friend of mine, a Dominican, Jovis Matthew. I think it's a wonderful stage about a priest who descends into mess. And yet, there is a little thread of holiness that emerges in his life, of which he's never aware, right up to the end, when he thinks how easy it would have been to be a saint and he missed it. But actually he is becoming a saint. Now, I think that sprung from Graham Greene's, it sounds slightly ambiguous, Catholicism, but it's what he saw, I think, also in his friends like Gervais. And because it's beautiful, the power and the glory, it's thy power and thy glory that's at work in human lives. So I think these novels certainly sustain and enrich one's faith. I wouldn't want a novel to be written as a sort of exercise of propaganda. But I hope that if it's written out of a desire to explore human complexity, one's belief in the ultimate benevolence of God will somehow surface.
And looking to the future, what kinds of, are there other areas of, other kinds of novels that you're looking at?
Gosh, I think there's some really interesting modern American novelists that I would like to study a bit more. I think Jonathan Franzen, Corrections, Freedom. I have a lecture coming up on freedom, and my first resolution is I will reread Jonathan Franzen. And I think there are also young novelists from Nigeria particularly who I want to read. So I hope that until finally I collapse and I put in the ground, I will go on discovering new novelists who will broaden my heart and stretch my mind open.